Hi, I'm Dubber. I'm the director of Music Tech Fest, and this is the MTF podcast. I first met Matthew Hawn when we were both speaking at a digital music industry event in London about 10 years ago. I say we were both speaking, he was speaking, and I would have been had I not suddenly developed laryngitis and become completely incapable of making any sound whatsoever. All the same, somehow I managed to make myself sufficiently understood at the time, enough for us to stay in touch and eventually become good friends, which we are today. Back in those days, Matthew was the head of all things digital at Sony Music. Both before and since, he's had a colourful, diverse and, critically, influential series of roles at a number of organisations. These days he's head of product for Audio Network in London. That's still the case, and I double-checked earlier today just to be sure. Things move pretty fast. Between the recording of this podcast episode a couple of months back and you getting to hear it today, Audio Network was sold to Entertainment One for a reported $215 million US. Here's Matthew Hawn, storyteller, digital music pioneer, and audio networker. Matthew Hawn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
Good morning. So you're Chief Product Officer at Audio Network. Let's start with Audio Network. What's Audio Network?
We are a music company that makes music for film, television, advertising, and increasingly just all the places you find digital video, which is pretty much everywhere now.
Right. And you commission the music?
Yeah, we are. We commission, record, mix the whole thing at a super high quality. We consider us a music publisher in some ways. We find the composers and artists out there, and then we bring them together. We're one of Abbey Road's largest customers, so we tend to do it at a very high quality, full orchestras, the real deal.
Right, fantastic. And okay, let's talk about your journey there, because that's for me, that's really the interesting bit. Let's start right at the beginning. What is the child Matthew Hawn running around? Is it about technology? Is it about music? Is it about what was driving you?
So I was a literature major to start. I mean, it was not technology or music really where I started. I wanted to be a journalist. It was probably the strongest one. I was definitely after the literary journalist era of, the Tom Wolfes and the Hunter S. Thompson, maybe with less drugs.
Right.
At that time when I was young.
Less, but not none, I know.
None. I didn't say none, but you got to be careful with that. But it was definitely a time in which I was interested in storytelling and telling a story in a very literary way. Mm-hmm. So I was a big reader. But growing up in San Francisco, you couldn't avoid the technology. I grew up in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and I went to university at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz.
What did your parents do, and how did that affect?
My parents were both professionals, but they were the first in their generation to go to college. So my dad ran hospitals in the Air Force, and my mom was a medical technologist. She was a hematologist. So science was both their backgrounds.
Okay, and you rebelled by going to books.
They were. I mean, there was never a negative thing. It was never like you should go do this thing. It was always just where we ended up. And I was a huge reader. So and I was alone on an internal kid. So read a lot on my own and got kind of led to reading pretty much everything. Literature, books, magazines, the whole thing.
Yeah, and of course, San Francisco is not just a technology town; it's a music town.
Well, yeah, no. But the thing was, when I left Santa Cruz, thinking I was going to be a journalist, there really weren't a lot of choices in San Francisco, magazine-wise. I mean, there was Sunset Magazine, which is a magazine of the West, as they describe it, which is mostly how to plant succulents in your garden and how to make a redwood deck. That's kind of what they did in the magazine.
And you weren't going to bust that wide.
That was not my world. That was not. But there was also Macworld magazine, right? And it's also the time that Wired was coming into being, and Boing Boing, right? Boing Boing, Wired, and Might magazine were all across the street from Macworld magazine.
When are we talking?
This would have been 92, 93.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the technology companies magazines are still a thing, right? Where the internet's not a thing. And I ended up joining Macworld after doing some stuff for Wired early on. I ended up joining Macworld, hired me as an editorial assistant, which I thought, this is brilliant. I get to do a paid job and I started writing for them. And I ended up writing most of the internet stuff that they did, right? So, because it was starting and no one really thought it was that exciting. The editor-in-chief famously said to me, this is really going to be just a niche, right? It's going to be like CB radio. This isn't going to go anywhere. I disagreed from it early on. I saw the value of that. And so I wrote a column for Macworld for a couple of years called NetSmart. probably the first column in a magazine for Macworld that was about the internet.
Yep.
Wrote one of the first reviews of Netscape Mosaic when it came out. FTP protocols, all the exciting.
How many stars did you give it?
I actually gave Mosaic like 3 or 4 stars, and mostly because I thought the potential here is amazing, right? I mean, this is 1,000 flowers blooming, and the ability to publish yourself and I actually thought personal pages was going to be it. That was going to be the thing I thought was most interesting. Justin Hall was out there doing his own, probably the first blog was Justin in that early time. So the first couple of pages go up and people's personal pages come online. Media companies weren't there. It was still an academics world and, the whole World Wide Web consortium and
the Wild West metaphor.
Oh yeah, we were, we at Macworld, I eventually ended up making Macworld Online. My friend Suzanne and I founded Macworld Online, so we did the first online magazine, Racing Wired to be first online with a magazine. Our first advertiser was Adobe, who bought out the entire run for 6 months of advertising. Where a little banner would run across the top. And we did some early audio stuff too, right? We got a chance to use the Real Audio plugin. It was us and the White House who had the first beta of that. The White House got it, we got it. And I ended up putting up about a 45-minute audio clip of Survivor Research Laboratories, the art group in San Francisco who basically, make machines that battle each other and make noise. And it just sounded like, 2 garbage trucks fucking, basically is what it sounded like. They were just like huge mess.
Yeah, that's what you want on the internet.
Sorry about that, but that's what it was.
Yeah.
And Mark Pauline, who was a local San Francisco guy, and I had a conversation about it. And we put it online, and I think maybe 500 people listened to that early audio clip, and it was, it was early.
That's really interesting. I had no idea that Mark Pauline was involved in that because he's so influential in the industrial scene.
Yeah, the SRL was his baby, and it was all over San Francisco. You go under a bridge, and Mark was setting up his machines and having and getting in trouble with the police and
some robots made out of dead rabbits and that
totally
sort of thing.
All kinds of but it was a fun time. And Macworld didn't stop me from doing that because they really didn't know what we were doing.
Because it does seem kind of countercultural.
Oh no, it was not. I mean, Suzanne had been. She was the editor of Macworld Online, and Suzanne was a punk writer in very music and interested in music, and she lived with Jello Biafra, the Dead Kennedys, and so we were very much the alternative wing of the group. There was another guy, Thomas Gowecki, who was PC World, and he was the publisher of PC World, and that was very much more corporate. But the Macworld guys were all like, we had 5 people, they had like 50 or something like that.
So you were the prototypes of I'm a PC, I'm a Mac.
Oh, we were totally the opposite of like, our main programming guy had like purple hair, and it was definitely the punk version of the Mac group.
Right.
It was a pretty well established group. Macworld was very profitable at that time, right? It was kind of just before we start losing the Mac's influence at that point, but.
Yeah. Wow. And but you didn't stay there.
No, Suzanne and I both left together. She went to MSNBC. As the editor of a TV show, or as the web editor, I think is what they called her, for a TV show called The Site, which was a primetime television show, ran from 8 to 9 o'clock every weeknight on MSNBC when MSNBC launched. Right. So we were the web and television. We had a website and we had a TV show, and our host was the excellent Soledad O'Brien, who's now, has gone through CNN, and she now does her own thing online, but she was our host, and we had one of the world's first virtual characters. It was a 3D animated character that I named called Dev Null, which was a total inside nerd joke. Yeah. And Dev was our host character interacting with Soledad, and it took a Silicon Graphics workstation the size of this coffee table to run at the time. And it was a puppeteer ran it, right? A person who actually did puppeteer stuff to make it work.
Is it kind of a Max Headroom?
Yeah, very much. He would talk, and we were projected against a green screen, and Soledad would interact in real time with this puppet. And it was actually voiced by Leo Laporte, was the Leo who's done a ton of podcasting, early tech podcast guy, and was a big part of the network when it launched. And Leo was the voice of Dev Null.
And how did you get into the music side of things?
So, right around 98, after kind of doing this stuff in tech space, and I was enjoying it. I really was liking it. It was fun. It was exciting. The money started coming west, right? I mean, all of a sudden, you got to realize this is Yahoo was the big group at the time. Google was just coming up. You could tell the money was coming out, right? All the newspapers were putting offices out in Silicon Valley, and they were all there to cover the money. But they were financial reporters. Very few people covering the cultural side of it, right? And I thought, this isn't really where I want to be. And I suffered a pretty big breakup and a romantic ending of sorts, and went to live in New York. And when I went to New York, my friend Peter, who was at Universal Music, said, I need someone to come help us figure out what Universal is going to do about their digital music strategy. Would you like to do that?
Yeah.
And the time when I was at MSNBC, I was really the music, gaming, and cultural, what's happening with the arts in technology was my beat. And so the idea of actually getting my hands on the actual industry that I was so interested in, because I'd always been a huge music fan, was really exciting. And I came in as the senior director of, I don't know, digital transformation or something ridiculous title that meant nothing, but basically sent me out looking for where Universal was keeping all of its masters and where the artwork was and where was all the video, how we're going to digitize this and turn it into a real product.
Yeah, because the first step is making that stuff into digital content.
And and we all know how sexy metadata is, but how do you describe all this stuff, right? As soon as you're moving into digital, how do you describe it? And this is even pre-search problems, but we all came to learn that the hardest thing was going to be the data about all this stuff. Like, how do you find it? How do you find the music that's out there? But we had to get it and digitize it so we could have something to sell as a product.
Was the kind of the ownership, who has the rights to these things, a significant challenge?
As always, I mean, it's kind of who has the rights to do this. The record labels will tell you that they own the recording masters, and they do. That's the deal they have. But you also know that there's been decades and decades of battles over those masters, right? Who has the copy, and they were horrible stewards. I mean, I'll just be blunt. The Universal was a horrible steward of its archives, right? I found photographs of, original photographs of Motown artists, holding up a desk and shoved under a folder, and a whole desk leg up, it was crazy. Wow. We found Jimi Hendrix master tapes in a vault with water dripping into it in London. I mean, just, classic stuff like that, just like, and because they had these, they'd made copies of them and they put them in, the place that they do all the mastering in the Emil Berliner studios in Europe. But most of these places are the studios in New York. Sony was better than Universal. They had a better sense of archiving than Universal did, which is where I went after Universal.
Right.
But none of these companies really thought too much about how they were storing this stuff. Archival stuff was not their goal, right? They were trying to get stuff out.
True, but tape decays.
Totally, and especially, I mean, we had one of the places we had was a room where we had 4 ovens where we would bake tapes, because there was this, this thing about in the mid 70s to 80s, there was a certain type of Scotch tape that they were recording on, and it would separate, the magnetics would separate, and the only way to bring it back was to literally heat it up to like 110 Fahrenheit or something like that, and it would stabilize the tape long enough to get a transfer. Right. So in the recording studios is a whole row of ovens where they were baking tapes to try to recover the 24 tracks that they'd had.
Right. There's another catastrophic batch of Ampex 456 in the 90s as well.
Totally. It's exactly, there's just a bunch of that kind of stuff. And so that kind of archiving thing, which wasn't really my world, to be honest with you. I mean, it was exciting to do this because I was traveling around figuring out what we were going to do. And we ended up doing something a lot low tech because the cost of the archive, which I at some point said, look, in order to recover all this, it's $20 million plus to do this. And they had Boston Consulting Group come in and say, yeah, that sounds about right, and nod sagely at us. And we ended up going to actually just sending all the CDs to a place in Seattle and said, rip these and we'll get started. And we'll work on the archiving separately. But in order to get started in digital, we need to just get going. Yeah. So we literally sent our entire catalog of the top 10,000 albums to a CD ripping place where students were ripping them just like you would have done for your own home thing. Wow. And good quality and got all the metadata right, but it was really to get started so we could figure out what was going on.
Sure. And is that what took you to London?
So, it's going back and forth a lot. I mean, I was on planes all the time from New York to London. And then I came back kind of just before 9/11 happened, and I was going to quit. I was actually done with what I was doing for them. And Matt Carpenter, who was at Sony at the time, said, do you want to come and work on this other thing, which is, now that we got all this stuff digitized, how do we distribute it? How do we work with partners? And I have a problem in Europe because we just need to fix it. And would you go there? And I was going to go to IDEO. Actually, IDEO had asked me to come and be a product guy at IDEO to work on media stuff. And I thought, that sounds good, but London sounds better. Just would be a good place to go. And so I went there to run digital distribution for Sony for Europe and Asia. And so from there, we work with all the probably 400 or 500 different partners. And we went from revenue, that's kind of the explosion period, right, for music at the time. I mean, I wouldn't say it was anything we were doing brilliantly that made us that rich, but we went from a couple $100,000 in digital revenues to more than $250 million in 2008 when I left.
You were pretty knowledgeable about music when you got there, though. I mean, this is something that's sort of been a thread all the way along.
Yeah, so I'm a huge music nerd and worked in record stores. I grew up around music. Back when I was wanting to write, music was always the thing I cared about. So it was always really important to me. But and discovery is one of my favorite things. How do you find something new? I've always been interested in that concept. And so going to work for a record company and getting my hands on the archive and then the history was phenomenal. My favorite group at the record labels, both places, was the catalog teams, right? The catalog teams are the ones who reissue and remaster, and they know what they've got. The frontline guys are like, it's like Groundhog Day. It's always the same thing. They just run through, hey, it's bright and shiny, and then they lose their memory and they go away again. But the institutional memory of record labels are the catalog groups,
right?
And they are amazing. They're just great people.
Right. And so what was your role in Sony in terms of, sort of the day-to-day?
So it was an operational role. I think I was VP of digital operations. I think it was that point I've got some, ridiculous title that they give out. But it was digital business was the group at there, and it was in conflict, to be honest with you, with the physical distribution guys who were, kind of the mobsters you'd expect them to be. I mean, it was a very rough and tumble place where it was about how many units of vinyl you shipped, right? That was the point. And the way we measured our business was very different than we did digitally. So as that world is falling off and dying, I'm in the fast-moving, shiny group, and my suggestions are not really, because I'm fairly senior at that time, they're listening. I get to go to the meetings, but I make suggestions they don't like to hear, like we should digitize the whole catalog and put it on Napster because it's like radio, and that was and I got not invited back to certain meetings after that. But,
right, because I see you as again being somewhat countercultural within that corporate environment.
Well, it was harder with Sony than it was. I mean, it was nice because we were building something fast, and there was a lot of money happening quickly. Once we'd built the team out, and it was about 45, 50 people who did the operational thing, but it was working with small partners, right? We worked early on with Last FM, where I ended up going later. We worked with Spotify. We worked with Vodafone. We were working with all these new companies and to try to figure out how we were going to get music to their customers, right, and our customers. But we were still treating it like a distribution method, right? We were going to ship units to them, and they were going to sell them to customers. We were not actually doing direct-to-consumer sales, which is what I asked to before I left Sony. I was in charge of direct-to-consumer at Sony, where we built out a way for Beyonce to sell you stuff directly, and Bruce Springsteen to sell T-shirts, and Christina Aguilera to sell perfume, which we did.
Right.
So there was always a bit of a new thing, but at some point after 8 years at Sony, I was like, I can't do this anymore. There's a little red dot in front of my desk. I'm like, what is that? Oh, it's where I've been banging my head for the last 8 years, right? We're just not going fast enough. This is not fun anymore.
Right. Because around that same time, I was thumping my fist on tables and saying the record companies are getting it all wrong.
Yep.
That's obviously a simplistic view of the world, but that was the effect. How much of that was institutionalized, and how many people like you were there?
There was always a number of people in the companies who were smart and cared about music, right? I mean, there was a whole lot in the middle that were Deadwood, let's be honest. I mean, you could have considered me Deadwood from a different angle, right? There was a lot of people there, right? But it was also a bunch of people who love music. These people didn't start because they wanted to, be bankers. And as the corporate labels kind of came in, there was a roll up during the time I was there. Polygram gets acquired. We go from like a bunch of indies to a bunch of majors, and then the majors start buying up the indies. So it's getting really corporate around this time. Yeah. But you still have some great people, some real music heads, and they're mostly in places like the archives and in the catalog group, and they're struggling. They're trying to figure this out. So I have a lot of sympathy for that group, because I don't think any of them were out of their way to stop people. There were certainly a lot of banker types at the top, and I could name half the heads of those labels, and those are the guys I do think were the bad guys in this. Right. They were really protecting the industry from moving, because they were making a lot of money the way they were doing it. Yeah. It was peak, I joined in the peak period, right? 40 million in revenues just as Napster happens, and you see it hit that iceberg, and you're like, okay, we're going down, but there's still people rearranging deck chairs, right? They're like, oh, we need to move this over here because it's going to be fine. Like, no, we're sinking now, and it's going to sink, and we all need to get into boats, and we got to figure who gets in the boats, and it's the artists who should get in the boats first, please. But we didn't do that. We threw a lot of people under the bus during that period.
Wow. And then Last FM.
So Last FM was, I looked at the companies I was working with across Europe, and it was exciting because I get to work with a lot of them, right? We were talking to people who were doing really cool things, and I'm like, I'm on the wrong side of the table. I'm negotiating with these guys, and I'm trying to figure out how to get them the music, and we did a great job at that. We were very efficient, but the truth was there was like 5 or 6 companies that were really worth working with, and Last FM was top of my list because they were really a discovery and an indie player. And
well, you said you were interested in discovery, and they seem to be doing it pretty well.
They were the top of this. And that time, the idea of collaborative filtering and the algorithmic location of stuff was combined with a human, right? I mean, their algorithms were always based on human need, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't based on here's some one guy telling you what this is going to look for. It's based on, well, what are your friends looking at? What are your collaboration? You know, if you and I both like the same piece of music,
chances are this.
Yeah, there's going to be an overlap, but there's going to be a good Venn diagram. And they were the best at that, right, at the time.
Right.
Pre-Echo Nest, pre-Spotify, all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So that social paradigm for music recommendation was the only thing at the time, and the way that I talked about it was it's the only thing that could tell you that if you like Prince, you might also like Joni Mitchell.
Totally.
No other algorithm is going to do that for
They
you.
wouldn't have made those connections. And they were also, they were a radio model too, right, which appealed to me, right? The idea that you didn't need to own music was really interesting. I mean, it had a Spotify that figured that 2004, they really combined scrobbling, which was the technology that built the data to do this, met their radio concept. And, there's a lot of hype about Pandora, but I think it was an American company, and their whole genome approach was theoretically novel. But what Last FM was doing and the data scientists at Last FM were world class.
Yeah, I got to say, the reason I like Prince is not because it's got an 8-bar intro and it's got a high male vocal and, it's in a major key, which seemed to be Pandora's answer to everything.
Yeah. They had, the genome was, I'm not going to talk shit about the genome. It was a great idea and it made a lot of sense, but they were really looking at about 1 million tracks. Last FM's database held 120 million. I mean, bigger than any record company's catalog. We knew not only what was being released, but we knew what you were playing. And as soon as one person played it, we had it in the database, right? So it was stuff that wasn't released. It was everything. It was, it was really the deepest, and it's still deeper than what Spotify has now, right? There was just a wider range.
Who's got that?
Last FM still does.
Right. Okay. So that's still proprietary.
So yes and no. So what was exciting for me at the time, outside of Last FM, the only other place that was really holding on to this kind of music was Music Brains, Robert Kay's nonprofit, and I sit on the board of it still to this day because. And they have a bunch of small projects, and they are used by all the big guys. They don't always like to admit that they use that data, but Robert's been collecting release data in a way to essentially create the metadata of the internet that way. And it's wide, right? His goal is to be like the Internet Archive, right?
Right. Okay.
So he's got that goal. They need a little more support to do that, but I think it's a great way. They've got a product called Listening Brains, which I think is very much like what Last FM was doing, and it was an interesting time, I think. Last FM didn't know what it had, which is why I left. Eventually, CBS acquires Last FM, and I'm like, I'm out now. This is not going to be the...
Right, because my next question was going to be what happened at Last FM, because it kind of dipped under the radar.
Well, so I joined there just as CBS has acquired that thing, and some of the founders are done at that point. And you kind of moving from a founder to a running a company differently. So they hired me as the head of product for there. And I was excited by the job. I'm like, this is going to be great. This is going to be fun. And for a while, CBS did leave us alone. And then they didn't. Right. And then at that point, they started trying to roll it up into some of their other properties. And we get moved out of radio, which is where it was, into interactive. Right. And let's just say the interactive guys and I didn't get along very well. So I lasted about another 6 months there after that happened. But I never quite convinced them the most important thing here was the data, right? The data and the listening profiles, and to be the connective tissue across services and to have a single profile. I still keep my Last FM profile running. I mean, it's Spotify still scrobbles. It still tells me what I've been listening to. It's like Fitbit for music. I mean, you can always get that music through. And Spotify does have that, and the Echo Nest guys really took the Last FM playbook and ran with it. And credit to them, they were smart guys. Brian and Paul Lemire and that crew was all really, really smart. And so their acquisition of 100 people, Last FM had a data team of maybe 8 to 10.
Wow.
So the size that we were, the punching above our weight so much that period. Yeah. The diaspora of programming and AI knowledge and machine learning knowledge was from that group has all gone to Apple, it's gone to Expedia, it's gone to Netflix, it's gone everywhere. But CBS never knew what they had.
And you went kind of sideways from there.
Yeah. Let's see what I do after that. I took a year off actually and said, what do I want to do? And I work for an interactive gaming company called Sensible Object, who built an interactive physical game that was like reverse Jenga. You built a tower and it created a world on a tablet, and when the tower falls over, the game ends. I work for the BBC on their music app that they were building. This has now become their word and music app. That's a little like NPR One. It's a kind of a podcasting and music app that I like with Chris Kimber, who's a fantastic guy there. And then I went to Samsung, which was another odd sideways run. That was a wider thing. It was no longer just music. It was film, music, games, everything. And I lasted a year there. Fascinating year, learning about Samsung and how that culture worked, but ultimately realizing I was going to be ineffective there.
Right. So where have you, I guess, ended up?
I didn't actually know what I was going to do next. I thought, well, this is weird. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I was looking around for companies. Maybe I'll jump out of music, and I love music, but maybe it's time to jump ship and do something new. And then a recruiter came and said, look, I've got this company, and they're a B2B company, and I want you to go talk to them because they sell music for film and television, and and I'm like, I've never heard of them, but you should talk to them. And I went to Abbey Road to meet the founder, Andrew Sunix, and the chief executive officer was a guy called Chris Blakeson at the time. And I'd found out they'd been around for 17 years. They'd been making music. And the first thing that really struck me was their artists and their composers were all making really, really good money because sync is an interesting problem. And what they'd done is they'd solved the sync problem, right? I mean, in a lot of ways. The production music is used. You need it for everything. You need not just the main track for the intro of a television show, but everything else, all the other music that goes with it. Yeah. And they just started with a really basic concept of being super simple to license, owning the recording right and the publishing right in one place, which are usually kept separate in the music industry. Yeah. So if you want to license Radiohead, you have to go to talk to the recording label, the Parlophone EMI group, but you'd also have to talk to Radiohead's publishers, which were often in a different group, right? Yeah. They were Warner at the time. So you've now got two different people who both don't really want to work together, and it's just making it hard to license music. Mm-hmm. So they made it simple, made it really inexpensive, but then the smart thing was that publishing right, when it gets recorded, when it gets done on television, it gets broadcast, that royalty rate's the same as Radiohead's rate. So it's not, those are statutory rates. And so by having it simple and making it easy to license and making it really fast meant that they quickly became a dominant player in the music space, particularly in Europe.
How does this differ from something like KPM and those kind of music libraries that you get?
So APM or Killer Tracks or Sony are all owned by a major, right? So most of them. Extreme is owned by Sony, I think. Killer Tracks is owned, I forget how they break down exactly, but they're all broken down by it. They have an association with the majors. And what they generally do is they keep them separate, right? They like, I don't want any more, artists shouldn't go anywhere near the production music group. Right. And we'll have this other stuff, and it's largely generic, and it's, some of them are quite well recorded, but essentially it's clip art, right? It's clip art music, right? For these places. And that's really true of the low end too, the Epidemic Sounds and the Premium Beat. These are all companies that are doing really basic, it's fine, it works great, but it's not made by an artist who cares about what they're doing. And so we went out and got people who scored films and advertisements and games, and we found these folks and said, you're gonna record something for us. We're gonna put it online. It's gonna get used. 11 offices around the world that are gonna sell this to TV and film and advertising groups. But we want you to make the music that you make, right? And it's meant for film and television, but we're a sync first music company.
Yeah, it's really interesting because one of the things when I first came across Audio Network, I went, hang on a second, I recognize some of these names.
Yeah.
And from jazz and from electronic music and
I mean, Tim Garland is a amazing jazz musician, and he's been around and he's done several albums for us, right? We have we have Johnny Lloyd, who's in the Mystery Jets, is one of our indie, and he's done a ton of Britpop guitar bass music that's great. We have our DJ Radio 1 DJ. It's just people like to come make stuff for us because most of these guys don't just stop with the one record they make for the record company. They're always making music.
Sure.
And not everything is designed to go on and be used. They make an instrumental version and cut down versions for us. It's designed to be used in a production, which is quite a fun job, right? You see where Trent Reznor's gone with Atticus Ross making, it's not the same as his Nine Inch Nails music, right? But you can do that, right? Yeah. Musicians can work in both areas. And when they find they can do that with us, they get really excited and they like to sign with us. We're not exclusive. We don't require you to sign your life away and sign your rights away. You do sign the rights to us to represent you in the masters, right? The masters belong to the Audio Network group, but you always keep your publishing, and that publishing split is 50-50. So it's really quite clear, which is not what you get when you go to most publishers, is a 50-50 split.
Looking back over this journey from where you've ended up, does this make sense as a narrative in retrospect?
I think it does, in the sense that what's exciting to me about this group now is it's one thing to make film and television, but it's also exciting to watch what's happening with the internet again and the democratization of media, right? We're sitting across from each other right now in a room, and you've got amazing equipment here that would not have been available to you 10 years ago.
Sure.
Right? And the way to get it out to people is just, so for me, making music for creators is the next real excitement. I mean, it's great. We've done it for the 5,000-10,000 production companies out there you already know, but it's the next 20,000 production companies you don't know that I'm excited by, right? Francis Ford Coppola famously said, the next Coppola is a 14-year-old girl in Des Moines you don't know yet. And she's going to make this because she's going to have all these tools.
Right.
Robert Rodriguez, who's here in Austin, famously, his book Rebel Without a Crew is all about how do you make media for no money and how do you become, and you can do that with the internet, and you can do that with the music we create. So I'm excited to see what people do with the music, making it accessible, making it more rich. So it does make sense to me that it's a natural extension.
And it sounds like the stuff that you got excited about in Mosaic back in the
same
day.
thing.
Yeah.
Same. I wrote a column for Macworld back in '94 called, I think it was Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom. It was about personal pages, right? It was about blogging. We didn't call it blogging then, but it was like, you want a voice, right? You want to say something to the world. This is a phenomenal way to get it out there. And it's, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, and we all own one now. Right. So we have the ability to reach a lot of people now, and with the distribution tools we have. And this just makes music democratic as well, because not everyone can make a beautifully scored soundtrack with 120-piece orchestra in Abbey Road, right?
Sure.
But you can now, as a creator, get access to that music on our catalog for $10. We'll license it for you globally, worldwide.
Right.
That to me is very exciting, right? That means more people can use what we do. Now, if you're a high-end corporation who's doing this, we're going to charge you more than that.
Yeah.
But you as an individual, we should be able to do that.
Does that make you an optimistic person when it comes
I'm
to music
incredibly optimistic, despite I like to think of myself as a pragmatic optimist, right? You have to actually get shit done in the end. You don't have to make compromises, but you have to think, how do I get it done instead of just holding my my ideals to an unreasonable standard?
What's next, do you think, for you?
It's a good question. We're at an interesting point with the company, right? I mean, it's been 17 years of this company. We've turned a corner. We've got a lot of new executive talent and a great new marketing person who's come on, who's really starting to make the stories behind our music pop. If you went to the website today, you'll start to see that, right? You'll start to see that the stories behind the music is becoming important to us. And it's not the case when you look at production companies. We've got a great new salesperson who's come in. And so I'm excited about the next 5 years for this company. Yeah. I'm hoping that I want to stay in it. We've got some exciting things coming with
well, you're a storyteller, so there's a place for you, clearly.
And it's fun, and it's a fun place to be. And as a product guy, I mean, I made the switch from being the guy who looked in the vaults for things to building stuff now. And I got a taste of that last FM, and I don't think we're done making things here. Getting ways for people to get that music is exciting for me. So we've done a plugin for Premiere Pro, so you can find our music within the editing software that pretty much anyone can use.
Right.
And I'm excited by some of the generative music things that are coming in this space, where you can take a piece of music and turn it and shape it into what you need it to be. I view that as a collaborative tool, not a replacement tool. There's a lot of people saying robots are going to write our music, and I think that's like saying synthesizers are going to destroy music, right? It's just not true. It's just a new tool. It's a new element.
Absolutely. Matthew, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
That's Matthew Hawn, Head of Product for Audio Network, which was recently acquired by Entertainment One. And that's the MTF podcast. By now, you should know what to do. Subscribe, share, like, rate, review, say nice things about it on social media. And while you do that, we'll go and prepare the next one. Seems like a fair deal. Also, we're going to be in Croatia this week for MTF Pula. We've partnered with Infobip, one of Europe's fastest growing software unicorns, where we're going to be hosting the MTF Labs with a bunch of high-level expert MTFers and a selection of Infobip's brilliant engineers and thinkers. More on that across all our channels. We're Music Tech Fest on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and now r/Music Tech Fest on Reddit. We'll catch you there and back here next week. In the meantime, have a great one. Talk soon. Cheers.